Okay, everybody, today we're going to talk about decentralizing waste. Now, this is a rather odd concept because I talked about decentralized circular economies before, and this is the reason why. But first of all, let's have a bit of a definition as to what we're talking about when we talk about decentralization. Decentralization is ultimately the process of empowering agents in a network, all on equal footing, and removing the central hub of an organization to create a more resilient, effective set of operations. Now, this means it's not a hierarchical process, it's not what's called vertically scaling. We're not talking about creating one great big um, uh, infrastructure to rule them all. We're talking about splitting them up and placing those parts, if you like, in this case, deep embedded within communities. We talk about circular clusters a lot, and the reason for that is we combine a lot of that within Automedi's operating model. But in order to understand why that's the case, it's worth talking a little bit about how waste processing is done today. So when we first deposit your waste and it's first collected, it usually goes through a series of steps. First of all, it is collected in bin lorries and taken to material recovery facilities or possibly straight to landfill. From then, any material that can be used is sifted, taken out, and the rest is distributed in a number of different ways. Those ways aren't all equal and they all have different carbon footprints, and crucially, they're not even distributed equally. Incineration probably forms the biggest bulk of how we get rid of plastics. And that's one of the worst ways of actually getting rid of plastics because it releases particulates and other emissions. And crucially, those incinerators have to be kept fed. You have to keep feeding it with rubbish. So otherwise, you've got to start burning oil, which becomes really expensive really quickly. Those facilities mean, or running of those facilities means that you have to keep finding waste from somewhere. Now, that's obviously a terrible, terrible incentive to create more waste. But what's even worse than that is also looking at areas of exporting it, because we're exporting this stuff often to countries which have no ability to process that waste in any way, shape, or form. And there are a number of other sort of I'll call it distributed distribution options rather, but generally the vast majority fit into these four, which is again, as I said earlier, a really terrible way of disposing of that waste overall. Now, it doesn't stop there though. The other thing that we have is once we've disposed of this waste in a typical take make waste cycle, we also have to replace the items with other goods. So, for example, if we have a single use straw, for example, we often have to replace it with a single use straw. Don't replace it with a single use straw, don't use them at all, in fact. But crucially, there are products which we simply haven't got a choice over. But that gives us a bit of an issue because not only are we obviously collecting and disposing of that waste using the facilities we've identified earlier, but we also then create a new channel, if you like, of processes which also accumulate more miles and carbon as well as energy usage from the manufacturing as well. Right, so we've got an aggregating process which takes waste from a number of different locations, puts it into one great big facility, which has exponentially higher energy requirements than and carbon emissions than the individual waste that was collected. But we also take a very high energy environment in terms of the conventional factories and oil processing and refining facilities, aggregate those together, put those onto freight, only to transport them to wherever they're going to be used, and disaggregate them again back into warehousing and distribution channels. So what you have when you think about how our need, if you like, maps out, and specifically how that turns into waste collection and products, what you see is a series of aggregation processes, which then only disaggregate again. Now, what that means is basically you do one thing only to then undo it later. And each of those has a material and a carbon footprint because you're transforming them typically across sectors. So when you do that and start to realize that fact, you start to realize actually why are we bothering to do that at all? Why are we aggregating only to disaggregate again? Why are we taking away two and then adding two again? Just take those steps out of the processing. And what this suddenly allows you to do is to start thinking about circular microeconomies, which is the model that Automedi uses. So imagine being able to recycle and process your waste into product in the building you're in or in the community that you're in. The amount of transportation is radically cut down. But crucially, you now have access to a very resilient supply chain. Every bit of waste that you have can be turned into a product. Right? Now, suddenly that product could be used, for example, for repairing the building. It could be used as parts. It could be custom products. It could be all sorts. And each of those is all suddenly done within the bounds of your building. Right? So there's no long distance freight anymore. There's not the transportation of brand new products made from virgin plastics 5,000 miles to then be sold on the shelves of a UK shop. Right? You are cutting out huge amounts of conventional supply chains in both directions. Right? You're getting rid of a lot of the material disposal process, and you're also getting rid of the vast majority of the supply chain, teleporting products effectively that you've made out of your own waste. And these tight circular economies deliver a humongous benefit. If you look at conventional supply chains, which typically cross different industries and usually require either consortiums or some downstream service to buy the waste that you've disposed of and processed, with circular microeconomies, you're doing it yourself. You don't have to wait for the existence of another industry somewhere else who might want to use your waste. You are creating it. You are creating the new circular economy, which includes the manufacturing and disposal all in one. And that allows you to radically cut down even above and beyond conventional circular economies. Right? So, I mean, one example to pick out the Remaster project, which we did earlier this year, we took away some 11.16 kilograms of CO2 from the product supply chain, right? Which is almost all of it was got rid of because we were suddenly able to recycle and process that waste locally. Not only that, that also means that all the cost that you would have spent per product on all the rest of this supply chain, now you don't have to spend it. This allows products to be made extremely cheaply. And ultimately, this allows a rethink, if you like, a significant rethink of our economies more generally, making them more resilient, creating a kind of manufacturing sovereignty within each nation or even each town or village. And that's how you can create these resilient systems from highly distributed, highly federated networks, if you like, of manufacturing, also sort of circular economies, which encompass manufacturing and recycling all in one. So this is ultimately the reason why you should start thinking about clusters, because you are not aggregating and disaggregating services anymore. You're also cutting out quite expensive and carbon intensive processes, which are an essential part of current supply chains, but don't have to be going forward, especially if the price of oil continues to rise. And it's worth stating at this stage, to give you an idea of scale, just on the manufacturing side alone, you are using 0.25% of the energy using circular microeconomies like Automedi compared to conventional injection molded systems. So I hope that you found that useful. Any questions, of course, you know where I am.